Welcome to today's session on making integrations key product features. My name is Marcus Edgington, and I'm the VP of Product at Prismatic, and I'm thrilled to share some insights with you all today on the topic of product integrations. Before we dive in, I'd like to give a big thank you to Product School for hosting this webinar. Your team puts out some fantastic content for product managers, and I've personally referenced your resources many times. So I'm excited to contribute and add to the wealth of knowledge that you guys already provide. So during this session, I'm going to be talking primarily to those of you working at B2B SaaS companies. You guys should be thinking of integrations as an important part of your company's B2B SaaS product strategy. And there's some tactics that you can implement to build high quality integrations that scale as your company grows. Before joining Prismatic, I was a product manager for several B2B software companies that relied heavily on integrations to bolster the capabilities of their core product offerings. There's one experience in particular that I always like to reference, and that's early in my career. I worked at a company that built hundreds of integrations during my time there, and it was just one of those markets where you weren't going to compete without those integrations. We were a really successful company. But building and maintaining those integrations was difficult, especially as we were growing. It was not uncommon for us to spend, 50% or more of our development capacity during a given quarter working on those integrations. So it's from experiences like that, that I've seen firsthand the value that those integrations can provide to SaaS companies. But I'm also just as familiar with the challenges associated with building those integrations. As a product manager, you, as much as anybody else in the company, understand the importance of making the most out of your developers' time. And if development of integrations is not going well, or your customers aren't getting the value out of them, it's especially painful because that's time that could have been spent on expanding your core product offerings. And this is a challenge that most B2B companies face when building integrations, and it's a big reason I wanted to join Prismatic. At Prismatic, our goal is to make it easier for B2B SaaS companies to connect their product to the other products that their customers are using. So I encourage you guys to take a look into products like Prismatic, which can accelerate and simplify your development of integrations. But today I'll talk about some development and design strategies that you should be following when you're building integrations, regardless of whether you choose to use products like Prismatic or decide to build a more homegrown solution. So before we get into those tactics, I want to reinforce the importance of these integrations to your product strategy. Studies show that the average mid-market company is using over 100 software applications for their daily operations. That number blew me away the first time I heard it. And to be honest, I was a bit skeptical. But when you really stop and think about the number of software applications that you use on a daily basis, you're gonna quickly run out of fingers to count those applications on. And then after that, go talk to someone in another department like marketing. And they're probably going to list a few of the same applications that you thought of, but then they're going to give you a whole slew of other applications, some that you maybe never heard of. So it adds up quickly. 100 is definitely not out of reach. And some of you listening may be building SaaS products that are completely reliant or relying on receiving data from one of those other products. Especially those of you that are working on more AI-focused applications. But even if you're not building a product that is 100% reliant on third-party data, most of your customers are still going to want your product to integrate with their other products so that they at least have data consistency across their large software ecosystem. Integrations are going to eliminate dual entry. It's going to decrease the amount of time employees need to spend in multiple applications. So if you're a B2B SaaS vendor or working for a B2B SaaS vendor, I can almost guarantee that your customers are expecting at least one integration to the many software applications that they're using. So for many years, offering up a robust API was the go-to answer for vendors that wanted to enable their customers to connect those applications with the other applications that they're using. But that's just no longer enough. Customers are now expecting their SaaS vendors to provide many of these integrations as out-of-the-box functionality rather than something that they have to build on their own. If they use over 100, if they're having to build over 100 integrations for all those products, it would take an entire team just to build and maintain those integrations. That's obviously something they don't want to do. And if you're not offering these integrations, you should be at least expecting that your customers are going to be doing that, and it's going to give them a leg up. So for many of you, it shouldn't be surprising to hear that integrations are a top evaluation criteria for companies that are looking to add to their software ecosystem. What we're looking at right now is a report from G2 that essentially supports that. If you're selling into customer service, sales, or marketing groups, take note that integrations are your buyer's top concerns. And this research is essentially reinforcing that without the right integrations, you may not even be getting in the door with your prospects. I'm sure that many of you perform a similar way of thinking when you're buying software. You may have seen some cool new product management software, but it's likely the first question that you're going to ask yourself is, how does this work with my development team's ticketing system like Jira? Or how are the requests that my support team is capturing and managing integrated with the software system? So given the importance of integrations, I think you should be treating your integrations as if they're a key product feature, just like any other feature in your app. To make that happen, I've identified what I think are the three most important things that product managers should be focusing on, regardless of whether they're building their first integration or their 100th. Number one is effective planning. You want to make sure that you're building the most impactful integrations, and you don't want to be caught off guard by the amount of time that it's going to take to build those. Number two is building integrations and an integration infrastructure that supports scale. If you don't, you're going to be spending way more development time and professional services time than you should be. And three is visibility. For many buyers, your integrations are going to be just as important as your core product, so they need to be discoverable. All right, let's jump into each of those, starting with planning. There's three elements of good integration planning. The first is to make sure you're evaluating potential integrations alongside any other core product feature that you might be consider building. So as I mentioned earlier, I worked at a company that had spent over 50% of our development time on integrations on a somewhat regular basis. So as a product manager, it was a hard bullet to bite because it often meant working on integrations rather than on core product enhancements. Unless you have a team that's going to be dedicated to working on those integrations, saying yes to an integration oftentimes means saying no to something else in your product. So it just is extremely important to pick the integrations that are going to provide the most value. And the best way to do that is to evaluate a potential integration the same way you would any other product feature, which is focusing on the desired outcomes. Many companies are looking at integrations as a dirty laundry sitting in the corner of the room that they know they're going to have to get to at some point. But with this mindset, you're more likely to prioritize the easiest things first, rather than the most important things. And you're doing that just for the sake of decreasing this ever-growing list of integration requests in your backlog, rather than focusing on what's really going to matter the most for your product and for your customers. So when you're choosing which integrations to work on, don't overlook integrations as solutions to some common things like product differentiation. If the market that you're competing in has gotten really crowded, offering integrations that others don't have, or potentially integrations that are more robust than your competitors, is going to help you stand out. Integrations may also be what you need to enter a new market or a new vertical, especially if you have some gaps in your product that are necessary to be in that, to compete in that space. Integrations may help you fill those gaps as you're continuing to build out your product to meet that new vertical or that new market. And the last example I have here, one of many, is customer churn. Integrations, we like to say that integrations are going to make your product stickier. It's a lot harder for a company to replace a product if it's tightly coupled with their other system critical applications. So after you get to the point now where you have an understanding of which integrations that you want to build, and so it's easy to immediately start thinking about the business logic of those integrations, such as what data do you want syncing between your system and another system, or how often is that sync happening? But you can't overlook some of the more foundational things that are going to need to exist for a good integration to exist. And this is especially pertinent if you're building integrations for the first time. But many companies are forced to revisit a lot of these core integration elements because they'll start to fail once they hit a critical mass of integrations with customers. So right now you're looking at a list of these underlying or foundational things that need to be accounted for when building the integrations, deploying them to customers, and managing them after they're live. So let's take a couple examples. So if you're building an integration that needs to connect to third-party systems, you obviously need a way for your customers to authenticate into those systems. Most applications these days support OAuth 2.0. And that's because an integration with OAuth 2.0 is going to result in a much better user experience for your customers because they're going to be redirected to a login screen that they're used to using. But there's quite a bit that goes into actually implementing integrations that use OAuth 2.0. You need an infrastructure for generating and receiving the authorization URLs. Once it's authenticated, most software applications are going to expire tokens. So you need a service that'll periodically refresh the token. On top of all that, another thing to keep in mind is that OAuth is a standard, but most products don't follow that standard to a T. So that means even if you've implemented OAuth once before in a prior integration, it's not going to necessarily be a simple rinse and repeat implementation of OAuth for the next product or the next integration that you're working on. You also need a way to deploy these integrations and support them. Ideally, your team or your customers will have a consistent experience for activating these integrations. We'll talk a little bit more about that in an upcoming slide, but the best way to do that is with a product marketplace combined with a self-serve integration configuration experience. Another thing to keep in mind is that when deploying an integration, after you've deployed an integration, you're likely to iterate on that integration. You want to make it better. So you need a way to version and manage releases of those integrations. And lastly, you're going to need tools for monitoring and supporting those integrations. Integrations are just like any product feature in that they're not always going to work correctly. In fact, the likelihood of issues increase with integrations because you're working with not only your product but another company's product as well. So you're increasing the risk that something's going to happen. So as a result, integrations are going to stretch the demands of your logging and alerting system, and you need to have a system that's ready to handle that. So assuming you have the infrastructure in place, you need to be able to define how a particular integration is going to work. So just like when you're building a feature, there's a lot to consider, and you want to make sure that your development team has the information they need to hit the ground running. And most importantly, you're going to want them to build an integration that your customers actually want to use, that they're actually going to get value from. Every integration is a little bit different, but there is some commonality from one integration to another. I've listed some of the most common things that you need to be exploring. Like, for example, what's going to cause your integration to run? Is the third-party product that you're working with have some kind of webhook system? If it doesn't, because that probably means you're going to have to do some kind of regular polling for changes. If you do that, how often is it going to happen? Are you receiving data are you just receiving data from a third-party system, or are you pushing data back to that system? I mentioned OAuth 2, but there's a lot of other auth services. Many products do not support OAuth 2, so you're going to have to make sure that you count for that in your user experience. And the list goes on and on here, but these are all things that you need to be thinking about and plan ahead for before you hand this work off to your development team. And just like any other feature, you should be spending some time talking to your customers to make sure that the integration is actually going to provide value. As you're thinking through how you want this integration to work, definitely do not try to account for every single scenario you can dream of. Just like a good product feature, start with what you think is going to be the most important and iterate on that as needed. All right, so we've talked about how to plan for integration. So let's dive into what I believe is one of the most crucial aspects of building integrations, and that's reusability. We've talked, this approach is often referred to as building integrations with a productized model. This would be opposed to the services model. In the services model, you're typically going to build a custom integration for a very specific customer. Let's call them customer X. And you're going to enable it for them. Then customer Y comes along and they need a slightly different version. So you create a whole new integration with some minor tweaks to that original one. While this might work for a small number of customers in integration, it's quickly going to be unsustainable as your customer base and your overall integration offerings grow. So in contrast, with the productized model, your goal is going to be to build an integration once and publish it to a marketplace or catalog or whatever you guys decide it should be called. And then using the marketplace, your customers can enable that integration and configure it to suit their specific needs. That can be done without requiring you to create an entirely separate version for each of your customer that has slightly different needs. So this approach means that you're going to maintain one integration and customers tailor it themselves through the configuration. If a change or a fix is needed, you're only going to need to update the integration once, and it would be able to propagate through to all of your customers. And I'll be the first to admit that this approach isn't always going to work. Occasionally, you're going to have a large enterprise prospect come along with requirements that are going to push the limits of what your current integration configuration can support. Ideally, you'd extend your configuration capabilities to accommodate them. But if that still isn't sufficient, it's crucial to have a sustainable way to build and maintain those bespoke integrations. And this could be achieved by reusing portions of your integration logic rather than starting from scratch each time. So make sure you're implementing integrations in a way that allow you to do that. Now let's move on to what I consider the last step of a successful integration, which is giving your integrations the visibility they deserve, essentially making them discoverable. If you're going through all the time building a quality integration, you want to make sure that both your prospects and your existing customers know that they exist and that they can easily enable them. So let's start with the concept of the marketplace that I talked about before. So for existing customers, you should have some kind of app listing like this, where your customers can find the integrations you offer and self-activate them. Of course, this isn't a novel idea. I've got an example here from Slack and Notion, and I can almost guarantee that all of you have used something like this before. Most of the larger and popular B2B applications have something like this. But for these smaller and medium-sized companies, something like this app marketplace can feel like a daunting task to build for their customers. But there are now software products out there, especially in the embedded iPaaS space, that make this marketplace experience well within reach without putting your core development or your core product development on hold. Finally, the last comment here is just make sure you're including them in your product docs as well. Doing so is going to make them feel like a first-class feature, and it's also going to make them more discoverable from prospects that may be looking at your docs. Speaking of prospects, integrations are going to be top of mind when they're buying, like we discussed before. So you should be prominently displaying these integrations that you support in the main navigation or on the first page or somewhere easy to find on your website, just like you would for any of the core features of your platform. This wouldn't have to be every integration, but at least the products that most prospects are interested in. You can make it easy for them to open a separate page that allows them to search and filter and find any integration that they may be interested in from there. And not only should you be displaying these integrations in your marketplace, but your product marketing team should be promoting them in whatever communication mediums or channels that you guys are typically using. Whether that be a press release or social media, get a LinkedIn example over here, or any kind of email or outbound communication that you're doing. And just like core product features, if you're releasing new integrations or significantly changing those, you want to make some noise about that. All right, so it's pretty hard to talk about marketing and integration without briefly touching on pricing. Integration pricing is one of those topics that we could dedicate an entire session to. However, I think the quick answer here is that you should not price integration separately if you can. Your customers are thinking of these integrations as features, and pricing features separately would not be well received by your prospects. So you probably shouldn't be doing that with your integrations either. You're going to be better off finding a way to incorporate these integrations into your existing subscription plans. Perhaps you would offer some kind of core basic integrations in a lower tier, and maybe a more comprehensive or niche integrations in your upper tiers. There's obviously a lot of ways that you can do this, but at the end of the day, just make sure it's going to be easy to understand and it's going to feel fair to your customers. You want integrations ultimately to be an advantage, not a sticking point in the sales cycle. The good news is that if you're able to follow the productized model that I mentioned before, this approach to pricing integrations is well within reach. So to summarize everything that I've discussed, if you can get good at planning integrations, making them reusable, and surfacing them to your customers, you're going to see more success in sales. Your development is going to go smoother, and all of that is going to carry into just an overall better experience for your customers post sales as well. So this is all much more attainable if you shift your thinking to thinking about making products as a first class feature in your product rather than the dirty laundry in the corner. So thanks a lot for joining today's session. If you're interested in learning more about integrations, you can find many great blogs and even an integration spec template at our website, prismatic.io. Thank you.